Yeah, we got the best room in the house with some background entertainment with the Omegas. Thanks, gentlemen. So we're just getting some last folks in here and maybe some additional chairs, making sure the door is unlocked. I'll introduce myself and introduce our panel real quick and moderator, and I'll pass it over to our moderator officially. My name's Kellen LaCour-Connet. I'm climate ecologist with Taproot Earth. Thanks for joining us today and for this breakout session, Centering Self-Determination in Disaster Planning and Recovery. We have a really amazing panel for folks, so I will not talk any longer and we can get underway. I'll pass it over to Maddie, who's going to be y'all's wonderful moderator today. Thank you.
Good morning. Whoa. Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us. I'm Maddie Sloan. I'm the director, she, her pronouns. I'm the director of disaster recovery and fair housing at Texas Appleseed. And we are a legal nonprofit that works on policy change issues at the state and local level across Texas. And I started working in disaster recovery after Hurricanes Katrina and Rita in 2007. I started with Appleseed and have been working on disaster recovery in some form ever since, which, as you know, we have done more work, has turned out to be, of course, fair housing work and environmental justice work and civil rights work in a huge variety of ways. I'm going to introduce our other two panelists who are here. I just wanted to acknowledge we did have two panelists who are going to be virtual, and we're very sorry not to have them here. David Wheaton is at NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I had the privilege of working with him in Texas on civil rights issues related to Hurricane Harvey, particularly around the disparate impact on renters, people of color generally. And then Jen Deerenwater, who leads, I apologize, I literally just looked at the name of her organization. Crushing Colonialism. Okay, I thought that was it. She is an excellent organization name. And I just wanted to read, well, I'll do this in a minute, but I'm going to read a few paragraphs from an article she wrote that I will recommend to you to bring her voice into the room. But next to me is Kate Thorstad. She is a staff attorney at the Civil Rights Education and Enforcement Center, where she leads the Disaster and Environmental Justice Project. Her work centers disabled people in disaster and environmental justice work more broadly. Kate began her legal career as a staff attorney and Justice Catalyst Fellow at Orleans Public Defenders, and came to the Civil Rights Education and Enforcement Center after working as an Equal Justice Works Disaster Resilience Fellow at Disability Rights Louisiana. She currently serves as Vice Director of the American Bar Association's Disaster Legal Services team, where she works to address inequities in disaster preparedness and response through a disability justice lens. Her other areas of interest include political economies of health and caregiving, and she is based in, I'm not going to try to pronounce it. Okay, in New Orleans, Louisiana. Roishetta Ozane. Sorry, I should confirm that pronunciation. Is that right? Ozane. Is the founder of the Vessel Project of Louisiana, a small mutual aid and environmental justice organization. Additionally, she serves as the Gulf Fossil Finance Coordinator with the Texas Campaign for the Environment Fund. Throughout her journey, she has been fortunate to be recognized as an award-winning environmental justice advocate, and she has had the privilege of speaking on stages both nationally and internationally, including in Egypt, Canada, and Malaysia. Her primary focus has been championing for the rights of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, advocating for clean air, clean water, and sustainable communities that are not burdened by fossil fuel build-out. But most importantly, Roishetta is a mom of 6 and a grandmother of 1, and they are who she's trying to save the world for. So I am going to just start with a little bit of table setting. I am going to read from Jen's article, The higher rates of disability in indigenous populations are common anywhere the colonizer has invaded. This is caused largely by a legacy of systemic oppression and genocide that has never ended. This includes environmental destruction that has had devastating impacts on the health of indigenous people and has especially endangered disabled indigenous lives. The escalating climate crisis is increasingly impacting deaf, disabled, and ill indigenous people. Yet in the face of this destruction, little support or reparations are on offer. In fact, the disproportionate impact of the climate crisis on disabled indigenous communities is yet another aspect of colonial genocide that has never ended. So I wanted to start by saying that the terms people use to describe themselves do not necessarily align with the terms that the census or governments or oppressors use to define them. To the extent I end up using terms by which people do not self-identify, it will be for that reason, and please, if it is offensive or a problem, please let me know. I also wanted to start with a quote from Colette, from an article she wrote with Roberto Barrientos that I have really has shaped my thinking on disasters and has, I quote a lot. Disasters are not mere events. They are lengthy historical processes that begin long before a hurricane makes landfall. So how disasters impact people is a product of history. It is a product of colonialism, of long-term structural inequality, of discrimination, of segregation, of racialization, of long-term policy and resource distribution choices. You know, poverty is a policy choice. Segregation is a policy choice. And all of this is intertwined with our origin story of, you know, genocide, slavery, stolen land, and discrimination. So our history influences, obviously, where people live. Indigenous people were pushed off land and often into land that was less environmentally rich and more vulnerable. Racial segregation by law pushed Black Americans in particular, but also other Americans, into more vulnerable areas with less protection. And then there's a legacy of historical disinvestment in infrastructure and services, which continues to leave these communities more vulnerable to natural disasters. If we include, you know, industrial disasters, industrial facilities and fossil fuel facilities, our pipelines are overwhelmingly located in or near communities of color, indigenous communities. So there are man-made disasters that happen, you know, when these facilities catch on fire or explode, or are releasing excessive levels of pollutants for a long time. And I think we have and do see, you know, a mass shooting is a disaster. And we are seeing, you know, who is targeted in shootings like the El Paso Walmart shooting. How we got where we are is also very closely tied to our history of property ownership and valuing property over people. When we think about, like, how do we determine where infrastructure goes, there is often a benefit cost analysis that is based very much on what is the value of the property. And of course, property value is, you know, politically and structurally determined. You know, as an example, this has long-term impacts. So between 1999 and 2013, the provision of FEMA benefits alone, both individual and public assistance, increased the black-white racial wealth gap in Houston by $87,000. And that is a pattern across the country. It is not just a pattern for the black-white racial wealth gap, it is a pattern for the white Latinx racial wealth gap, white Asian American wealth gap, across the board. Disasters make white property owners better off and push people of color further into poverty. There is also, of course, disaster capitalism. People see disaster as an opportunity to take land, to make a lot of money on recovery. And it is also, I don't know what we would call this, but people see it as a political opportunity to displace populations, to remake communities, and to change how political power is apportioned. And I will talk a little bit about how our system is set up, and then I will stop talking. So the American disaster recovery system is set up to be reactive. It is not in any way proactive. It is set up to deal with discrete, localized, infrequent disasters. You know, a tornado hits a town, FEMA comes in, FEMA goes out, which is not the world we are living in any way. It is set up for middle-class people with insurance. You know, just openly, that is what it is for. The idea of FEMA is that you might need some initial help, you might need, 18 months of rental assistance, or you might need some money because your insurance settlement isn't big enough. But the expectation is you have insurance, you have resources, you will be able to find other housing, and you will be able to rebuild your house, go back home, be done. Our system assumes state and local governments have primary responsibility for disaster response, which is not how most state and local governments regard their responsibilities for disaster response. And it also assumes that we are going to restore things to their pre-disaster state without regard for either the fact that previous conditions were inequitable or that we might need to mitigate. There are, I'm just going to highlight a couple more issues that, FEMA is not intended to make people whole. I think most Americans, I would have said me before I did this work, think, great, there's a disaster, FEMA comes in, FEMA rebuilds your house, FEMA makes sure you're okay. Yes, I know, yes, that is an appropriate response to that suggestion. But FEMA, again, is really temporary assistance. There is no FEMA assistance for permanent housing rebuilding. So what the federal government has done is do supplemental appropriations and run it through the HUD Community Development Block Grant Program, and that is the money, really the only money for permanent housing recovery. But it's ad hoc, it relies on Congress to make an appropriation. Every time they appropriate it, HUD has to come up with a new set of rules. Takes a long time. I will say the one thing I like about it is 70% of it has to benefit low and moderate income folks. Defining that benefit is always interesting. So really, those are the two big federal programs that fund any kind of disaster recovery. Most states don't have any kind of disaster recovery program, so if a disaster is not big enough for FEMA to come in, FEMA does not respond to every disaster, people are really, really on their own. So who in the room has firsthand experience with the impacts of disasters and the climate crisis? Right. Would any of y'all be willing to share a little bit about what happened or your feelings about it? No obligation at all. I know this is also extremely traumatic.
I'll be brief to start. I'm down in Robinson County, North Carolina, which Lumberton was all in the media from Matthew and Florence.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Sorry. No.
It'd be great to get a couple of stories. I'm going to be very brief. I'm down in Robinson County, North Carolina, and Lumberton, of course, got hit really hard, and our whole county did. We have a river and 50 swamps and mostly wetlands, so Most of the county was never intended for people, and Donna Chavis is my spouse. And, indigenous populations lived there along the swamps to hide from European encroachment. So that's why the Lumbee population is so large, the largest indigenous tribe east of the Mississippi. But we also have Black and Latinx, and over 70% of our population is people of color. So we've been organizing for 40 years, including EJ work since '84. And then the hurricane stuff just caused a whole another set of injustices. We live in the woods, but with Matthew, the ground was already saturated. The trees came, the forest just came tumbling down. We couldn't get out of our yard for 3 or 4 days, and the Baptist men, they'd come in and cut us out so we could get out. And in Florence, we had 30 inches of rain. You couldn't even get out or in the county because the river and the swamps were flooded. So we've actually started a very model disaster survival and resiliency school just focused on South and West Lumberton, 90% BIPOC communities, indigenous and Black. And, my mantra is that disaster response is done to and for our impacted people and communities, not by and with them. And we just got to change that. And I've been totally traumatized by the whole thing. I've never seen a system, a public system so dysfunctional. And we've worked on every form of justice there for 40 years. I've never seen a state system so dysfunctional as disaster. Up against all the other systems, it's totally disempowering for those of us who are impacted by it. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Letitia Nixon-Jones, excuse my voice. So in 2016, I had just had my third child. I would sleep, if you know, you never wake a sleeping baby. My phone rings at 6 a.m. and it's one of my personal injury clients, and they're calling me and they said, Attorney Jones, myself and my son are on top of my roof and it's flooding. We called 911. 911 is busy. And I'm like, what are they talking about? I'm half asleep. The child is asleep. I hit my husband. We turn on the news, and an unknown storm had caused Baton Rouge to completely flood. So we had to just grab everything, throw it in the attic, and try and escape with the 6-week-old boy. And so from there, we actually wrote and did a grant with Equal Justice Works and started a disaster legal clinic. And so we've been going around trying to duplicate that in law schools and helping to train attorneys on how to be prepared, how to deal with people in crisis. And as an attorney, I was used to dealing with other people in crisis, right? But not necessarily myself being in crisis and then having clients that were also in crisis. So having to create a curriculum to help aid other individuals while you yourself is in crisis is what we've been doing and working with Equal Justice Works to do that.
So I'm going to tip this table at some point. Thank you. Yesterday, the phrase murder policy came up. Murder by policy, and I think a disaster. Katrina is the one that always comes to mind is really watching policy murder people in real time in a way that it can be harder to see. On that cheerful note, how are climate disasters exacerbating structural inequality in your communities and the communities you work? And how do our disaster planning and recovery systems further entrench conditions that deny self-determination?
Hi, everybody. Again, I'm Roishetta Ozane. I am the founder, director, and CEO of the Vessel Project of Louisiana, which is a small mutual aid and environmental justice organization. As you all know, in the last 3 years, the state of Louisiana has, I've tried to like work on the way that I say this when I say it, because we have been victims of climate-induced disasters, right, in Louisiana. These are not natural occurrences that have happened. A hurricane is natural, but to get record-breaking after record-breaking storm within 6 weeks of each other, that is not a natural occurrence. So we have been the victims of these climate-induced disasters that have been caused by the state of Louisiana and the fossil fuel build-out that we have in our state. We're surrounded by fossil fuel industries. As we know, fossil fuels release harmful toxins like methane and benzene that cause our climate to warm. They cause global warming. They cause other things like asthma and other health conditions. And so our state is killing us with this policy. And that's just what it is for Louisiana. But also, in addition to those hurricanes, we had Winter Storm Uri, as you know, and also a massive flood that also happened in the Lake Charles area. When we think about Louisiana, a lot of times we think about New Orleans. And I like to start off with telling people that Louisiana is a state. New Orleans is not the state. The state is Louisiana. There are several other cities and towns and communities in Louisiana that are not New Orleans. And so because of Hurricane Katrina, when people hear hurricane and they hear Louisiana, they automatically think to send resources to New Orleans. Well, when in 2020, when Hurricanes Laura and Delta happened, within 6 weeks of each other, we were literally drowning and trying to survive, and we were not getting the resources that we needed in Southwest Louisiana because we were not popular, we were not New Orleans, and it was like nobody cared about us. In fact, we always talk about Katrina, and we rarely talk about Rita, which happened a few weeks after Katrina, where several people lost their lives and homes as well. But again, happened in Southwest Louisiana, in the Lake Charles area, in New Orleans. We were not as popular as New Orleans. So again, let's talk about how those things happen within the state, and sometimes places are looked over. And also, even when you're outside of thinking about FEMA, which is the federal system that is supposed to protect people after these disasters, those state systems like OSHEP also don't assist those communities if they aren't in metropolitan areas like New Orleans. And so in Southwest Louisiana, of course, like I said, we had Hurricane Laura, Hurricane Delta within 6 weeks of each other, followed by Winter Storm Uri a couple of months later, and then a flood that happened all while we were all living during a global pandemic. And so I just tell my personal story because my story is so, outlandish that if this is what was my reality, imagine the realities of people that we didn't know. So you see me sitting here as this internationally known person, but at my core, I'm a single mom of 6 who in 2020 was leaving a domestic abuse marriage of 17 years. So when the hurricane hit, I was a single mom, just left my abusive ex-husband who was in jail for domestic abuse strangulation, and I had COVID. The news came on and it said that we had to evacuate. I was sick. I didn't have any money. I had 6 children, and one of those was a 2-year-old who I was still breastfeeding. And I had 1 vehicle. So I was like, okay, I'm supposed to put everything that I own in my car and leave while I'm sick. Where am I supposed to go? How am I supposed to afford this? When we think about FEMA, again, FEMA is a system that kicks in after a disaster. What kicks in to help people to even leave because of that disaster? There was nothing. Red Cross does not assist until after the disaster. All of these programs are after the thing happens. But it was a mandatory evacuation. We had to leave. Now, also, I want you to picture that this is a mandatory evacuation from a community that is surrounded by dozens of petrochemical facilities. Another thing that people don't know, what happens when there's a disaster declaration and there's an emergency or a mandated evacuation, the industries can do what they want because there's not supposed to be people in the communities at this time. So also while people were evacuating, one of those industries had an explosion because they were releasing chemicals at a increased rate because people were not supposed to be in the community. This doesn't give into account people who cannot leave the community, that have no means of leaving the community. But because there's a declaration and they're supposed to be out, we can do what we want because you're not supposed to be here. And if you're not supposed to be here, you cannot then sue us because we told y'all to leave anyway. So all of that was happening. And I was like, I'm not going to leave because, again, we live in Louisiana. We always get these storms. And they're not always as bad as they are predicted to be, right? Well, I didn't realize how sick I was with COVID at the time until one of my children came in the room to ask me if I knew we were supposed to be evacuating. And I was speaking to my child, and they were like, what? And in my mind, I was speaking to maximum capacity. Like, why can't you hear me? And they were like, it's no words coming out of your mouth, lady. What are you saying? And she was like, look at the news. They're saying that we have to leave. And she's 20 now, so she was about 17, I guess at the time, 18. And she said, did you see the weatherman is leaving? I was like, what? So she was showing me on Facebook that our local weatherman was saying, bye, Lake Charles, I'm leaving. And I was like, wait a minute, the weatherman? If the weatherman leaving, I got to get out of this bed and go, because the weatherman normally stays to report. And so I just grabbed my children. We jumped in a van with whatever we had, 3 days worth of clothes, my purse, and we left. And of course, we never were able to return to my house. My house was destroyed. A tree fell on the roof. The back wall was blown in. The back door was blown in. And that was from Hurricane Laura. 6 weeks later, of course, Delta happened. Delta was a rain event. The waters came in. And another thing people don't know is the way that FEMA identifies a flood. If the waters don't rise, it's not a flood under FEMA. But my roof had a tree on it. So the waters that rained down flooded my house. That didn't count. So I was not able to get any assistance from Delta at all. The only assistance that I was able to get from me and my 6 children who had lost our homes was a little bit over $5,000. And we were never able to return home. And so at the time, because I was a single mom who had just left my husband, I was living in a Section 8 house. It was not my house. It was also a Section 8 house, so there was a Section 8 subsidy. So along with the point she made of if you don't own the home, if you don't rent the home, if you under Section 8, you have even less rights. You have even fewer rights. You don't own anything. Nothing is yours. You count, and they don't count rooms the way that we count rooms. So it was me and 6 children living in a 4-bedroom house. So even though one of my children had to sleep in the living room on a pull-out sofa, that wasn't counted as a bedroom. So all of her things that was in there, that's not a bedroom. We don't care. This is what we define as a bedroom, a room with a closet. So it's things like that that we don't think about when we're talking about equity and we're talking about making sure that people have the means that they need before the disaster occurs, when it's that moment of emergency and everybody has to leave. And so we were able to, by the grace of God and community organizations and calling out to local churches, we were able to stay in a hotel for 6 weeks that a church paid for us to stay in Houston. Well, I was like, well, you know what? I'm going to just go back to this house. I know there's a tree on the roof. FEMA is going to tarp the roof. We're going to put a board on the back door. We're going to board up the window. And I have to stay here. I can't afford to stay anywhere else. I don't have any more money. So we went back to the house that had been damaged. FEMA was like, well, as long as you live in there, we can't help you. And I was like, well, FEMA, where y'all want me to live? We don't care, sleep in your car. But if you're sleeping in the house that is damaged, we cannot provide assistance to you. And I said, well, I have children and a baby. Their school, my kids' school opened back up, even though several of the schools did not. I could not keep coming back and forth from Houston to Lake Charles. And at the time, I was a paraprofessional. So I also had to go back to work at the school. Again, that's another part of this system. I was working for the school district, the largest employer outside of the oil and gas industry in the community, and I wasn't making enough to live in the community. I was only making $1,100 a month. That was my total amount that I was making. That is not what I was bringing home. I was bringing home about $700-800 a month, working at the school as a paraprofessional assistant teacher, and had been doing that for 11 years. And so all of this is happening, and I'm just like, if this is happening to me, if this is what I'm going through, and I think I'm pretty smart. I think I can figure things out. I think I understand FEMA. I've applied. I've received $5,000 worth of assistance because some people were like, I haven't received anything from FEMA. And I was like, how do I help the people who are going through what I'm going through or worse? So I got on Facebook and I started making posts and saying, what are you going through? What do you need? How can I help you? And oh my goodness, the replies from people I did not know, just looking for somebody to ask those questions and to list under there. And people were like, I need baby food, or my child is on oxygen. My child has asthma and needs her medicine. I don't have any dog food, or we're sleeping in a tent. Or people were sleeping in tents in their own front yard, and the police was going telling them that they could not sleep in tents in their front yards on their property because of the way that their community was owned. But they had nowhere else to live. So I hit the streets and started knocking on doors and going up to people and asking them, how can I help you? How can I help you? What do you need? All of this was happening when it was predicted for a record-breaking freeze to hit the area, Winter Storm Uri. You had people who had survived 2 hurricanes, were living during a pandemic, and now this freeze was coming. People did not have livable homes. They had tarps on their roofs. They had children. And there was a mayoral campaign happening. So while all of this was happening, Lake Charles was having a mayoral campaign. People were displaced. People were not in the community. So guess what? The same mayor was reelected because there wasn't enough people in the community. The mayor was reelected with like 5,000 votes in Lake Charles. So all of these things that were happening are the way that this system has been set up. If the system cared, that mayoral election wouldn't have happened, because people were not home. If the system cared, people would not have been approached by the police for doing the best that they could, sleeping in tents. If the system cared, people would not have had to sleep in tents in the first place. And so I was trying to figure out, how can I dismantle this system, actually, is what I was trying to figure out. But I could not get over the fact that people needed immediate help. People needed somewhere to live then. People needed food then. And so I said, I don't have a lot of money, but I'm going to help people the way that I can. We had just received the stimulus checks. And, of course, like I said, I have 6 children, so I had a substantial amount. I took that money from my stimulus check, and I began to get hotel rooms for people who were sleeping in tents or people who did not have adequate shelter for that freeze. At the time, I reached out to everybody who was on the ballot for mayor, everybody who was an elected official, everybody in the state, from GOSHEP to OSHEP to everybody. And I said, listen, we have this happening. The mayor of Lake Charles was saying, those are not our people sleeping in tents and sleeping under the bridge. Those are contractors who've come here that are trying to make money off our citizens. And I said, I don't give a fuck who they are. They're people who are sleeping in tents under the bridge. We have no hotels. We have no houses. We have nowhere for people to go. They refuse to assist people until the day of the freeze, when the temperatures began to drop below freezing. The city of Lake Charles constructed a plan. Their plan was for anyone who needed shelter to meet at this bus stop in Lake Charles, bring an ID, and get on a list for the bus to come back and pick you up. First of all, we had just been through 2 hurricanes. People had lost everything. A physical ID was destroyed. Nobody had a physical ID. If you were homeless, more than likely you did not have a physical ID. The other thing people needed was a phone because the bus was going to text them and say what time to be at the bus stop to get on the bus for their turn to get on the bus. Because again, this was a global pandemic and we couldn't put everybody on the bus at the same time because we had to do social distancing. If you were not at the bus stop at the time that your name was on the list to be on the bus, you could not get on the bus and they left you. We went to the corner where that bus stop was, and every person that did not get on that bus are the people that we put in hotels. And we put over 300 people in hotels that the city of Lake Charles did not help because they didn't have an ID or because they were not there on time or because they had reached their capacity of the amount of people that they were going to shelter. We didn't ask any questions. We didn't ask for IDs. We didn't ask for them to prove that they were residents of Lake Charles. A freeze was coming and people were going to freeze to death if they did not have shelter. As we know, those temperatures got below 17 degrees. So we put the people in shelters and the folks from around the city were like, oh my goodness, y'all have lost y'all's minds, putting people in these hotels, putting your credit card on file. What if they tear up the room? What if the drug dealers find out that all of the homeless people are in one hotel and they go over there and start selling them drugs? All of these things were coming from elected officials within the city and from other organizations that were supposed to be organizations that should have been the organizations that were helping the people. But these are all of their stipulations. And I decided then that my organization that was forming organically would never adhere to any red tape or any type of government bureaucracy. So when people ask me, do you have a 501c3? No. I do not have a 501c3 because no one will tell me how to assist people efficiently and effectively and give people the help that they need immediately. And so that is what Vessel Project is, and that's what I did at its core. But in doing this work, I kept running into the issue of the system that was in place that put people here in the first place, and what was fueling this system. And again, it went back to what's happening, looking at the landscape of Southwest Louisiana and at Louisiana. And what do we have in this state? We have a lot of oil and gas. We have a lot of pipelines. Well, if we're a state that's surrounded by billions of dollars, why is it that people could not survive and recover after these storms? Why is it that people from Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita are still recovering 18 years later? But yet we have billion-dollar industry here. Why is it that a person who was working for the local school system was not making enough to live in a community that is surrounded by those industries, in which the school board votes on how much taxes these industries pay? And so all of that was clicking in my head, and that's how Vessel Project went from emergency assistance and mutual aid organization to an environmental justice organization as well, because we had to get to the root of the problem and what was perpetuating that system. And that's why today I still provide the mutual aid and emergency assistance, but also help the community to understand what's happening, educate them on what's happening in the community, what type of hearings are coming up, what is being proposed for their communities, how they can fight back, and how we can build these communities to be resilient, but also how can we support the ways that these communities are already thriving? The things that they need, the things that they know are the solutions for them. And I think we're going to get to that later. And I know it was a really long, definition of what the Vessel Project is and what we do, because a lot of times when I talk about mutual aid and environmental justice, people don't understand why it's important. You can't say that we are assisting communities that are low income, BIPOC, low resources, and go in and just fight an oil and gas facility, win maybe possibly against that facility momentarily, and then leave that community in the same condition that community was in. That community is always going to face whatever harm is coming because that community has not been built resilient enough to fight against that. And what that looks like is fighting on all those fronts. So building power voters, not just going out and campaigning during major elections, but making sure people are voting during all elections and making sure that they understand that those smallest roles that they feel like people play, like the Public Service Commissioner, in which we were just able to get Devontae elected. People didn't know what a Public Service Commissioner was. They did not understand that, you know, a Public Service Commissioner has a big role when it comes to the amount of your electricity bill, the amount of your gas bill. When we broke it down like that, people were very concerned and they went to the polls and voted. Just saying Public Service Commissioner, they didn't know what that was. They didn't understand that that role had been situated for a wealthy white man, because the Public Service Commissioner is one of the lowest paid elected roles in the state of Louisiana. And Louisiana is one of the few states that elects a Public Service Commissioner. And after we got Devontae elected, the state of Louisiana is now looking at appointing Public Service Commissioners because they saw that we want. And so it's always this thing of, what will we be fighting next? And how can we build this community up so whatever comes at them, they are in a situation to fight it themselves, and we don't have to parachute in and assist them with fighting it, but they have the tools and the resources that they need to fight it themselves. So I know that was a really long time, but...
No, I think I should have just handed the mic to you first. That was the best summary of what's wrong with the system that I may have ever heard.
I tried, so it's a lot more wrong with the system.
Thank you so much, Roishetta, for sharing that personal experience and your powerful work with the Vessel Project. I don't have a ton to add, but I did want to tie a couple strands together here and maybe add or amplify one more dimension that Jen, I was hoping, was also gonna bring in and talk with us about. So I think what probably everyone in this room already knows, and what Roishetta was just saying, what Maddie helped lay some foundation for, right? Government responses to disasters. And when we're talking about response, we mean also evacuation. We mean resource distribution. We mean shelter. Inclusive of those later responses, they always multiply existing inequalities, existing injustices and marginalities. And, you know, disability rarely enters the conversation as a dimension of environmental justice, but people with disabilities, as Jen was talking about in her article, we bear the brunt of the climate crisis, and we face the worst rates of morbidity and death from disasters. Disability is also deeply racialized. Disability is often caused by structural inequalities and social determinants of health, whether we're talking about environmental, labor-related, other. And disability perpetuates itself by locking people into cycles of poverty. So in disasters, especially storms in the Gulf South, frequently, people with disabilities are often left to die or be warehoused in carceral settings and congregate living settings where they're robbed of their autonomy and self-determination. For elders and people with access and functional needs, often after a disaster, it's just the last straw. It's the event that pushes them into homelessness or into these carceral settings, jails, prisons, congregate care settings like nursing homes. And we also see, a lot of families that feel like they can no longer take care of their disabled family members once their home is damaged or destroyed, once their community is dispersed, because they no longer have that support, and they feel as though they have to place that family member again in a congregate setting where that family member is then separated from their family, their community, they're robbed of their autonomy. So I just want to bring that one little intersection into the conversation before we move forward.
Well, then I'm going to go right back to you, Kate, and talk about how can we move towards solutions. So what are some of the ways you at your organization is working on systemic change, whether that's litigation or mutual aid or policy work, completely reimagining the system. What are some of the solutions you're working on and towards?
Sure, I think maybe drawing first on what Roishetta was talking about a little bit, I think I'm a lawyer, obviously, so I work with the master's tools, and the master's tools are very powerful, but I think first and foremost, the most important and impactful thing we can do is get to know our neighbors. Literally just talk to your neighbors. I promise you that, our needs are going to be intertwined, our resources, are going to be intertwined, and we're going to find commonalities in areas where we need to work together. So I think first and foremost, the most impactful thing we can do is get to know our neighbors. Very low-hanging fruit in terms of solutions. I have, my laundry list of things I'd like to change at FEMA. The FEMA app, which is relatively new, that people often try to use in order to get FEMA assistance. It is not accessible. It is not compliant with Section 508 of the Rehabilitation Act, among many other issues with it. Roishetta was talking about running up against issues with habitability. So FEMA has this single standard of habitability. And it's kind of like their own magical definition that they don't want to define too much, but if they say your house is habitable, you do not get home repair assistance. So if you're living in your house, even if it is, by many legal definitions, one would think not habitable, they say, all right, it's habitable, no assistance for you. But one dimension of a problem with that, an accessibility issue there, is they have a single standard of habitability. So, and again, that's not one that they really want to define too well. But what that means is if you are a person with a disability or a person who has certain access needs in your home, where, if that is altered in your home or damaged or destroyed, your home is unlivable, FEMA will not recognize that. FEMA says that home is habitable. We have a single standard, and that's got to go. I also think there needs to be a way for people with disabilities to begin to interact with FEMA, to begin that interactive process from the get-go based on their disability. Right now, there's no avenue to do that. You basically have to have a lawyer, in the middle of just trying to put the pieces back together after disaster. You have to be lucky enough, basically, to get your hands on a lawyer who says, I'll help you with this, I'll contact FEMA and ask for this reasonable accommodation and duke it out with them, to try to get you what you need. Beyond FEMA, just including people with disabilities in coalitions on disaster, especially on issues with utilities. Roishetta was talking about our Public Service Commission. We know what we need. Communities know what they need. We just need to make sure that everyone has a seat at the table. And creating a council in your state or in your community, where you can work in partnership with the disability community around disaster planning and preparedness, using that council to leverage change and emergency operations policies to make sure the disability community has a seat at the table. Yeah, that's my little short wish list for now, but it gets longer.
I think, is it on? Yeah. When we're talking about moving towards solutions, a lot of times we think that solutions has this one definition that we have to stick with, and that's the only thing that solutions means. Like, how do we solve this problem in the way that we feel is the best way to solve the problem? And what that does is exclude the way that people have already been solving the problem on their own, the way that they've been living and thriving in their community outside of this disaster happening. And we don't help them get back to being able to survive in that way and amplifying that for them. Always go back to myself and my personal story. And so right now in Lake Charles, we only have one domestic abuse shelter, one. It is not a homeless shelter, right? If a disaster was to happen right now, because that one domestic abuse shelter is not sheltering people and has not been repaired since the last storms, if there are women who need domestic abuse assistance today, they don't have that assistance available in Lake Charles. And so if an emergency was to happen and those women decided, like I did, well, I'm leaving this person and I want to go to a shelter, and they go to the shelter and that shelter says, well, we're not sheltering. What are they going to do? most of them are going to either go back home or they're going to end up homeless or end up in a different situation than they are in, which could be worse for them. So we have to think outside of what we feel like a solution is. And the way that Vessel Project operates is, last Sunday I had an event that was breast cancer awareness and domestic abuse awareness. And I had to convince funders how that was me fighting against the industry. Because it don't make sense, right? Like, how is this domestic abuse and breast cancer dinner fighting against CP2? Well, the cancer rates in Southwest Louisiana are astronomical. And every woman that was at that event was a black woman who either had breast cancer or had lost a family member to breast cancer. All of the women in that room who had suffered from domestic abuse were black women. And all of these people in this room were people who lived in the community where Calcasieu Pass 2 is coming. A $1 billion industry is coming that will be built on wetlands. But yet you have no resources for the women who are in this room. There is no domestic abuse shelter. There is no cancer centers in Lake Charles that support these women of color who have very little resources. This is me fighting against this industry. So we have to look at how we can educate the community, include the community, tell the community stories, highlight the issues that are going on, incorporate joy, and further enhance and support the ways that these communities are thriving and trying to keep those communities together. Because what happens a lot of times with our solutions for communities, communities get broken apart. People are scattered about, which further perpetuates their recovery, right? If you're living in a community system, you know your neighbors, you know those people, they know your children, you've grown up here, you have your own culture, this is your environment. This is how you're living and thriving. If you need something, you know I can go ask my neighbor. If my water is brown, I can go across the street, girl, your water brown too, something wrong, because why our water brown? But if you put me in a community over here where I don't know them, if I'm dealing with a problem, I'm less likely to go and ask. I don't know them. I've never met them before. They're not my community anymore. So how are we keeping communities together and making sure that we're putting what's needed in those communities? So again, like I said previously, before those disasters happen, before those big fossil fuel companies come, that community is already in a position to fight against it. They're like a brick wall. You're not tearing us down. We have what we need here. We're not going to allow you to come in and tear that apart. If a disaster comes, we know how to survive together. We know, what's our evacuation plan. We know Miss Sue over here have 6 children. We got to make sure all 6 of her kids are good. So how are we making that system work for that community of people to make sure we're keeping that community together? And again, incorporating joy, because this is heavy work, right? We have to start highlighting why it's important to save these communities. Why are we fighting for the Gulf Coast? Because every time a disaster happens, the questions that we get in Louisiana are, why y'all stay there? Why y'all won't leave? Where are we going to go? Where there are wildfires? Well, guess what? Louisiana had over 40 wildfires this year, and there's currently a wildfire burning. And how does that directly connect to the industry? Because they're saying, oh, it's just the marshes burning. Well, pollution has been dumped in those marshes for years. That pollution that's burning, that's killing you, that's making you sick, that's giving you a headache, came from industry. So where do you want me to go? Where earthquakes happen? Well, guess what? If we get CCS, carbon capture, storage, and hydrogen pumped into the grounds of Louisiana, we're going to have earthquakes. Where do you want us to go? Where mudslides happen? If we get these DAC hubs, we might have a mudslide. So it's nowhere to go. It's nowhere to run. So how do we uplift and show the joy and the culture in these places and show people why we are fighting? When we have events like we just recently did Power Up in the Gulf, where we had Big Freedom, Manny Fresh, they were out there twerking for climate justice, and we were twerking along with them. We had new people out there who would have never come if we would have said, this is a climate crisis event. They would have been like, y'all crazy. This Louisiana, we don't believe in no climate change. If we would have said, this is a election event, ain't nobody coming, we don't vote. We had 27% votes turnout for the last election. But we said Big Frida and Manny Fresh gonna be here, and they was like, I'm coming. And it was full. I mean, that park was full of people. We fed them good food. We danced. We had music. But I spoke, and I'm real every time I speak. Devontae spoke, who is the new public service commissioner for the New Orleans area. Dr. Joy Banner of the Banner Sisters with the Descendants Project. She was one of the speakers. And people were tuned in, quiet, listening. And now we have new organizers from that area who are ready to get involved. So we have to think outside of the box. We have to incorporate the things that make people happy. You may not understand why paying for 10 red tents to give people massages is going to help us fight against this climate crisis. But if people in the community, if people on the grounds have been talking to people every day, and everybody they talk to said, I'm tired, I just need a massage. And you go back and give them that massage, guess what? They're going to be listening to you now, because you heard them say that was their need, even though they wasn't asking you for it. You heard that need, you fulfilled that need, and now they want to know how they can continue to have their needs met and what they can do to make those things happen. And that's my solution, and that's the way that I work. And many people say, well, where do you get your funding from, and how do you help so many people, and how do you keep going? And really and truly, I tell people that I'm a witch. I guess it's magic, but seriously, it's really when you're doing the work that needs to be done, and you're doing it in a way that is truly about the people. Because what we're doing every day, the reason we're doing this is to save lives. It is to save human lives. It's not to stop an industry. It's not to talk about climate change. It's not to point out that FEMA is horrible. It's not to not get the president elected. It is to save people's lives. If we don't do this, people will die. And if we don't do this, we will no longer have a planet Earth. There's no planet B. There is not a second chance at getting this right. And so this is why we fight. But how can we work together? How can we understand that a fight for LGBTQ, a fight for social justice, a fight for racial justice is a fight for environmental justice, is a fight for climate justice, and all of these are fight for human lives. And that goes into this whole ceasefire debate that's happening right now. These are human lives. So the fight that we're doing it's the same thing. It's the same group of people, the most marginalized, the lowest, the poorest, the same people who have been impacted, the people who don't have white skin, who don't have that background, folks who are from a different descent, a different tongue, who are impacted. So how do we connect those fights together? Support communities that support people who are just trying to live. And that's my theory of change.
I think it's a good one.
I thought he was trying to get in the door.
I figure we'll just keep going until someone tells us to stop, which you're about to do.
Not quite. We have until 12:30.
Okay.
We have a question back.
Oh, sorry. Bring the mic.
Thank you. It's really not a question, it's a comment. How do I say this? November 2nd, I went to D.C. to testify before the House Finance and Housing Committee about the role the insurance companies play in keeping disasters. And this is something that I'm an insurance and reinsurance retiree. 30 years ago, when I left and retired early, came into this field, I told people that this would happen because I hung around the geeks, I hung around the forecasters, and they were telling me, Sharon, 30, 40, 50 years from now, we're not going to have a hurricane every 3 years. We're going to have 3 hurricanes every 3 days. And we see it now. Years ago, we would say, okay, Hurricane Sandy is coming. Now we say, Hurricane Sandy is coming, and 3 more are in queue. The point I'm trying to make is that the insurance companies have been unfair to people of color since Lloyd's of London's role in slavery. And we need to make sure that folks have insurance. But more than that, they have adequate insurance. Oftentimes when people suffer from disasters and they lose their homes and they have nothing but sticks, insurance companies come in and you find out that not only you did not have insurance, but a lot of folks had evaporating insurance. And what that means is what you insure this year, you find that 5 years later, it's no longer on your policy. How did that get erased? Insurance companies do this intentionally. Another thing they do is renters suffer. And as we know, the majority of BIPOC folks don't own property. And when you have a renter's insurance policy, that doesn't include relocation, not at all. So we're talking about, the failures of FEMA, we're talking about the failures of the government, but we should also talk about the failures of the insurance companies that are supposed to protect your assets and bring you back to better than you were actually. But we don't. And the sad part of it is the same industry that insures and invests in the fossil fuel industry that causes the problem in the first place. How are we allowing them to then not pay the claims of people who suffer from what they're doing? Insurance companies are getting away with murder. They're making money from this disastrous situation called climate change. Every time there's a hurricane, we talk about the carpetbaggers who come into town and try to make money from disasters. We don't think about what the insurance companies are doing. They're making tons of money. They have reinsurers who protect them. And as I testified in Congress, did you also know that the majority of the insurers own reinsurance companies? So they're making money hand and foot. And we need to make sure that people of color and people who are marginalized and low income are no longer being taken advantage of by these insurance companies. Insurance companies, if you have adequate insurance, you have relocation expense money. But we don't have that. Insurance companies are not providing a place for us to go because we don't have adequate insurance. So it's a very long discussion, but we need to think about making sure that insurance companies do what they're doing. One more point I want to make is every day you hear about insurance companies leaving a market, leaving Miami, leaving Hartford, leaving whatever, restricting coverages. What's that going to do? Raise the cost of insurance. And without insurance, we're going to suffer. You can't get a mortgage without insurance. You can't finance equipment for your business without insurance. So think about the insurance industry.
I just want to thank you so much for that comment, which leads into what my job is, the job I get paid for, because Vessel Project is just my organization. I don't get paid for it. My job is the Go Fossil Finance Coordinator for Texas Campaign for the Environment. And what I do is campaign against the insurance companies and the financial institutions that fund and insure fossil fuel infrastructure along the Gulf and point out the fact that they are ensuring environmental racism when people in those communities can't afford the insurance because of the facilities that are surrounding those communities. Because as you stated, our insurance goes up after a hurricane, our insurance goes up after an explosion happens at one of those facilities. Neither of those things are our fault. We have to have the insurance, we have to have flood insurance in those communities, yet those facilities are getting insurance at a good rate when the people who they're killing can't even afford the insurance. So I would love to talk more with you about that, and we're trying to really get community groups and small organizations involved and educated on the financial side of the fighting fossil fuel.
Well, y'all, I'm sorry, we have to wrap up the formal panel. I think I'm certainly happy to stay and chat, or I think probably find, I don't want to tell you. Any of us are happy to talk. I mean, I think just to wrap all this in together, I think one of the things that probably everyone in this room recognizes, is that disaster recovery, like the work is not something we are doing at, discrete times. All of our work is disaster recovery work and climate change work, whether it's insurance or housing or, income stability, health, language access, immigration. It's all disaster recovery work. And I would just going to take one more second to say one of the things I hear a lot from people who are disaster survivors is, I hate the word resilience. Why am I expected to be resilient? Why am I expected to go through this trauma over and over and over again when it's exactly, what Roishetta has been talking about, we've been talking about. Resilience is about the fact that people don't have to go through this in the first place, and if they do, they have what they need to be okay. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and being in this discussion. It's obviously one that could go on for a long time, but we really appreciate y'all, and thank you so much to Kate and Roishetta. Really appreciate you, and I have taken many notes. I've learned a lot. So thanks, y'all.